My parents erased my college fund for my sister's wedding. The bank kept the paper trail. The number on the screen. My name is Melanie Reyes, and I was 34 years old the week I found out my college fund had become a cake table. I'm a senior bookkeeper for a mid-size manufacturing company outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I've spent 12 years reconciling other people's numbers, invoices that don't match purchase orders, payroll errors, vendor accounts that quietly bleed money if nobody's watching. I'm good at my job because I notice small things: a missing decimal, a transposed digit, a withdrawal on a Tuesday that doesn't belong to any bill. So when my mother handed me a folder of old paperwork to shred on a Sunday afternoon in March, and I saw the name of a savings account I hadn't thought about in 16 years, I didn't shred it. I read it. The account had been opened by my grandfather, Walt Reyes, the year I was born. My grandmother, Ruth, had added to it every Christmas until she died when I was 22. It was supposed to be for my education. I'd used some of it, not all of it, because I'd gotten a partial scholarship to Penn State, and my parents had always told me the rest would stay put for later, for when you really need it, like a house. The balance on the last statement in that folder, dated 4 months earlier, was $340.12. The balance had been $41,000 when I graduated. I sat at my parents' kitchen table, in the house I grew up in, holding a piece of paper that didn't make sense, while my mother rinsed dishes at the sink like nothing in the room had changed. And somewhere upstairs, my sister Ashley was trying on the wedding dress she'd bought 3 weeks earlier, the one that cost more than my first car. I didn't say anything that day. That's not how I do things, but I did something else. I took a photo of that statement with my phone before I put it back in the folder. And that photo is the reason this story has an ending instead of just a wound. If you're new here, welcome. I tell true stories about families, the quiet kind of family trouble that doesn't show up as a scream, just as a slow erosion you don't notice until the ground gives out. If this is the kind of story that speaks to you, stay a while. Subscribe if you want to hear how it ends, because I promise you, the ending is not what you'd expect from a story like this. There's no shouting match. There's a bank statement, and it turns out that's so much worse for the people who thought no one was keeping track. Let me take you back to where this really started. Not the day I found the folder, but 30 years before that, in a small brick house on Linden Street, where the rules of my family were written long before I was old enough to read them. The house on Linden Street. I grew up the older of 2 daughters. My father, David Reyes, spent 31 years as a mail carrier for the same 3-mile route in our town, the kind of job that gave him a pension and a bad knee and a reputation for knowing everyone's dog by name. My mother, Carol, worked part-time as the church secretary at St. Adelbert's, which meant she knew everything about everyone before they knew it about themselves. My sister Ashley is 5 years younger than me. From the time she was born, I understood, not through anything anyone said outright, but through 100 small signals, that Ashley was the soft one, the one who needed protecting, and I was the capable one, the one who didn't need as much because I could apparently handle anything. I was 9 when my mother told me, while folding laundry, "You're just built different than your sister, Melly. You've always had your head on straight." I didn't know yet that being told you have your head on straight is often just a nice way of saying nobody's going to worry about you. My grandfather Walt was my father's father, a retired steelworker who believed in exactly 2 things: hard work and compound interest. He opened my education account with $500 the week I was born and made it a habit, a real habit, the kind you could set a calendar by, to add to it every birthday and every Christmas. When Ashley was born 5 years later, he opened one for her too, though he told my father once, within my hearing, that he worried Ashley's would need more help down the road, that girl's got expensive taste already and she's still in diapers. He wasn't being cruel. He was just an old man who noticed things, same as me. My grandmother Ruth outlived him by 9 years. She kept up the tradition. Every Christmas Eve, she'd hand my parents an envelope for each account with a note in her looping handwriting, for Melly's future, for Ashley's future. She never made a show of it. It was just what she did, quiet as setting the table. I have a memory from when I was 16, sitting at that same kitchen table, watching my father go over the mail with a cup of coffee. A statement came for my account. Back then, they still mailed paper statements, and he opened it, looked at it for a long moment, then set it on top of the refrigerator, in the spot where important things went to wait for later. I asked him what it said. He told me, "It says you're a very lucky girl, and don't you forget it." I didn't think anything of it. I was 16. I had homework and a boyfriend and a part-time job at the drugstore. I didn't know that the spot on top of the refrigerator was going to become, over the next 18 years, the place where a lot of things about my life got quietly decided without me. The pattern with Ashley started early, and it wasn't dramatic. It was small. When I was 12 and Ashley was 7, we both wanted the same doll for Christmas. There was only one left at the store, and my mother bought it for Ashley because she's younger and she'll be more upset if she doesn't get it. You're mature enough to understand that. I did understand it. That was the problem. I understood it every single time it happened for the next 22 years, and understanding never once made it easier. By the time I was 20 and away at Penn State on my scholarship, working a campus job to cover what the scholarship didn't, Ashley was 15 and already the center of a particular kind of family weather system. She struggled in school. She struggled with friends. She had, my mother said, a sensitive soul, which was a phrase I heard so often growing up that I sometimes wonder if it was printed somewhere and just handed to my mother at the hospital the day Ashley was born. I don't want you to think Ashley was some kind of monster in training. She wasn't. She was a kid who learned, the same way I learned, what got rewarded in our house. I learned that competence got you left alone. She learned that need got you attention. Neither of us invented those rules. We just each played the hand we were dealt, and for a long time, I told myself my hand was the better one, because at least nobody was managing my life for me. I graduated from Penn State with a degree in accounting and $9,000 in loans, which my scholarship and the education fund could have covered without my ever borrowing a dime, if the fund had been what my grandparents intended it to be. I didn't know that yet. I was 22, proud of myself, and glad to finally be an adult who didn't have to ask anyone for anything. I should have kept asking. That was my mistake, if I made one at all. I stopped watching the account because I trusted the people who were watching it for me. 2 sisters, 1 ledger. My Aunt Diane, my father's sister, 7 years his senior, used to say that our family ran on an unwritten ledger nobody was allowed to read except my mother. Diane wasn't being unkind when she said it. She said it fondly, the way you describe a quirky relative's habits at a holiday table. Diane herself had been divorced twice by the time I was in middle school, first from a man named Roger who drank, then from a man named Frank who didn't drink, but who spent money the way Roger drank, quietly, steadily, until there was nothing left. Diane's own money troubles, I think, made her more sympathetic to my parents than she might otherwise have been, and less likely to ask hard questions about how they managed things. Diane's husband by the time I was a teenager was Pete Kowalski, a soft-spoken forklift operator who mostly stayed out of family business and read paperback westerns at every gathering, occupying a corner of whatever room the party was in with a kind of contented invisibility I sometimes envied. Pete liked me. He used to slip me $5 at Christmas for gas money. A small, private kindness that had nothing to do with the larger currents running through the family, and everything to do with a man who simply liked his niece and wanted her to know it. I bring up Diane and Pete here because of something that happened when I was 14. A small scene that I didn't understand the weight of until I was in my 30s, looking back with the clarity that comes from finally having all the numbers in front of you. It was a Sunday dinner, the kind where the whole extended family crowded around the table with the leaf in, and Diane, halfway through a glass of wine, said to my mother, not unkindly, "Carol, don't you think it's about time you told the girls what's actually in those accounts? Ashley's going to expect things to just appear the way they always have, and Mellie's old enough to start managing her own." My mother's face did something I didn't have a name for at the time, a quick, practiced smoothness, like a hand flattening a wrinkle in a tablecloth before a guest could notice it. "There's plenty of time for that," she said. "No need to make the girls worry about numbers before they need to." I didn't think about that exchange again for 20 years. When I finally did, sitting in my car outside Keystone Trust with 13 years of transaction history in my lap, I understood it as the first time I ever witnessed my mother actively choosing not to let daylight into the ledger, even when a trusted relative suggested it directly to her face. Ashley and I, growing up, were rarely given exact numbers about anything. We didn't know what our father made carrying mail. We didn't know what the mortgage payment was, or how much the church paid my mother, or what a year of Ashley's speech therapy in elementary school actually cost. Money in our house was a fog that adults moved through with apparent ease, and children were meant to trust the fog rather than ask it questions. I was good at trusting the fog. It turns out that was exactly what made me useful to it. Early adulthood and the slow education. I married Marcus Chen when I was 27. He teaches high school history 2 towns over, the kind of teacher who still gets invited to former students' graduation parties a decade later. We have a daughter, Sophia, who was 8 the year all of this came apart, and who is, without question, the best thing either of us ever built. Marcus met my family for the first time at Thanksgiving the year we started dating, and he told me on the drive home, carefully, the way he tells me things he's not sure I want to hear. Your mom asks Ashley about her feelings and asks you about your schedule. I laughed it off. I told him that was just how our family worked, that I liked being the reliable one. He didn't push it. He's not a pusher. But he remembered it, and 8 years later, he'd bring it up again, at exactly the moment I needed someone to remind me I wasn't imagining the pattern. Ashley, meanwhile, moved through her 20s the way a lot of people do, a community college stint that didn't finish, a retail job, a boyfriend named Kevin who my mother liked and then didn't, and eventually dental hygiene school, which she completed at 26 and which gave her a steady job, and for the first time, something that looked like real footing. I was proud of her. I want to be clear about that, because it matters for what comes later. I was proud of my sister. I drove 2 hours to her graduation from the hygiene program and cried in the parking lot afterward, genuinely happy for her. It was around that time, Ashley 26, me 31, Sophia 5, that I noticed the first crack in the story I'd been telling myself about my education fund. My father mentioned, at a 4th of July barbecue, that he'd had to move some things around to help Ashley with a car repair. I asked, casually, if that had come out of her account, the one Grandpa Walt and Grandma Ruth had built. He said, something like that, in the tone he used when he wanted a conversation to be over. I let it be over. I had a 5-year-old melting down about sparklers and a potato salad that needed to go back in the cooler. I didn't think about it again for almost 3 years. That's the thing about slow erosion. It doesn't announce itself. It just waits for you to be looking somewhere else. The house on Birchwood Court. Marcus and I found the house on Birchwood Court the spring I turned 30, a modest 3-bedroom colonial with a cracked driveway and a kitchen that needed work, but with a backyard big enough for the garden Marcus had always wanted, and a school district we liked for the family we were planning to start. We had enough saved for a reasonable down payment, but the seller's agent mentioned, almost in passing during the walkthrough, that a slightly higher offer would put us ahead of another interested buyer. I remember calling my mother that evening, not to ask for money outright, but the way adult children sometimes do, testing the water before asking directly, mentioning the house, the competing offer, the tight timeline, and saying, almost as a joke, I don't suppose there's any of that old account left that could help nudge us over the top, is there? There was a pause on the line, longer than I expected. Oh, Melly, I'd have to check with your father, my mother said. That account's mostly just sitting there gathering interest at this point, I think, but let me look into it. She called back 2 days later and told me gently that it wasn't quite as much as we remembered, and that pulling from it right now wasn't the best timing, what with your father's knee surgery coming up. I didn't push. I told her it was fine, that Marcus and I would figure something out, and we did. We made a slightly lower offer than the house was worth, waited an extra 6 weeks, and got it anyway when the competing buyer's financing fell through. I want to be honest that at the time, I didn't feel wronged. I felt, if anything, a little embarrassed that I'd asked at all, that I'd tried to lean on money that wasn't strictly mine to lean on. It would be 4 more years before I learned that my father's knee surgery that spring had, in fact, been paid for partly out of that very account, $3,100, according to the transaction history I'd eventually hold in my hands, meaning the account hadn't been not quite as much as we remembered. It had simply already been spent on something else, something my parents didn't think I needed to know about, 3 months before I asked them for help with my own house. I think about that phone call often now. At the time, it felt like nothing, a minor disappointment, quickly absorbed, quickly forgot. In hindsight, it was one of the clearest early signals of the whole pattern. Not that my parents refused to help me, but that they had already, quietly, decided who that money was really for, and it was never going to be me, regardless of what I asked or when I asked it. The announcement. Ashley met Tom Whitfield when she was 28, at a continuing education seminar for dental professionals, where he was selling insurance packages to the attendees during the lunch break. Tom is a good-looking, easy-talking man of 31 whose father, Gerald Whitfield, owns 4 car dealerships across 2 counties and is, by any measure, a genuinely wealthy man. Tom is not a bad person. I want to say that clearly. He's a little oblivious, a little too comfortable with money he didn't earn, but he loves my sister, and in the parts of this story where he could have made things worse, he mostly just stayed quiet, which I've come to understand was its own kind of complicity, but not the same as cruelty. They got engaged on a Saturday in October, at a restaurant Tom's father owns a stake in, with a ring that made my mother gasp audibly at the dinner where Ashley showed it off. I remember sitting across the table watching Ashley cry happy tears, watching my mother squeeze her hand, watching my father beam in that quiet way he had, and feeling something I didn't examine closely at the time, a small, cold awareness that I hadn't gotten that reaction when Marcus and I got engaged. My mother had said, "Oh, that's nice, Melly," and asked what caterer we were using in the same breath, like the engagement itself was a scheduling item. I didn't dwell on it. I had a marriage to plan and a career to build and a toddler who needed feeding. I filed it away, the way I'd filed away 100 small things before it, in the part of my mind reserved for facts I wasn't ready to add up yet. The wedding planning started in earnest the following spring, when Ashley was 29. And that's when the phone calls to my parents' house started happening at a frequency I could set my watch to every Sunday evening, sometimes twice, always about money. Venue deposits. Dress fittings. A florist who wanted a decision by Friday. I know this because I was often there, at my parents' house, dropping off Sophia so my mother could babysit or picking up a dish my mother had made for us, and I'd hear pieces of it drifting from the kitchen. I remember one Sunday in April, standing in the hallway with Sophia's diaper bag over my shoulder, hearing my mother say into the phone, "Don't you worry about that part, honey. Your father and I will figure it out. We always figure it out for you." I didn't think in that moment to wonder what figuring it out meant or where the money for figuring it out was going to come from. I had my own life. I had a mortgage and a 5-year-old and a full-time job. I wasn't auditing my parents' finances. I trusted them. That trust is the whole reason this story exists. The wedding fund. By the summer Ashley was 29, I was 34 by then, the wedding had a date. The following June, at a vineyard 40 minutes from my parents' house, with a guest list that had ballooned from small and intimate to 140 people. I found out the venue deposit alone was $6,000 because Ashley posted about it on Facebook, tagging the vineyard with 3 exclamation points. Tom's father was contributing, generously, from what I understood, but weddings like the one Ashley wanted always cost more than even generous contributions cover. And my parents, on a mail carrier's pension and a part-time church secretary's salary, were not people who had $20,000 sitting around for a wedding. I want to be honest about something here, because this story only works if I am. I didn't ask where the money was coming from. Not because I didn't wonder, but because some part of me, the part that had spent 30 years learning not to ask questions that might make me the difficult one, decided it wasn't my business. I told myself my parents were adults, capable of managing their own finances, and that whatever they chose to do with their money was their choice. What I didn't yet understand was that some of that money wasn't theirs to choose about. It was mine. It just happened to be sitting in an account with their names on it as custodians, from back when I was a minor, an account that, I would later learn, my parents had never formally transferred to my name once I turned 18, the way they had told me, for years, that they had. That's the detail that changes everything. That's the paper trail this story is named for, but I didn't know it yet. In the summer before the wedding, all I knew was that the wedding was getting bigger, the phone calls were getting more frequent, and every time I visited my parents' house, there was a new detail about flowers or dresses or the string quartet Ashley wanted for the ceremony. And every time, I smiled and said it all sounded lovely, because that's the role I'd been assigned since I was old enough to hold a role, and I was good at it. I was always good at it. Thanksgiving, 8 months before the wedding. Thanksgiving that year was at my parents' house, same as always, the same table with the leaf put in, the same tablecloth my mother had used for 20 years, the same argument about whether the turkey needed another 20 minutes. Ashley and Tom were there, along with Tom's parents, Gerald and Linda Whitfield, invited for the first time to a family gathering, which told me how serious things had gotten. I remember Gerald Whitfield, a big, friendly man with a booming laugh, saying over the mashed potatoes, "We're just so happy to help make this day special for the kids. Money's not something you should have to worry about on the happiest day of your life." My father nodded along, and I watched something pass over his face, pride, maybe, or the particular discomfort of a man who wanted to be seen as an equal contributor to something he couldn't fully afford. Later that evening, in the kitchen, drying dishes while my mother washed, I asked her carefully how the wedding budget was coming together. She didn't look at me. She said, "We're managing, Melly, we always manage." And then, almost as an afterthought, drying her hands on her apron, "You know, your father and I have been thinking. That old account of yours, the one from Grandpa Walt, there's still some money sitting in it, doing nothing. We thought it made sense to put it toward something the family actually needs right now, instead of just sitting there gathering dust." I want to tell you I said something in that moment. I didn't. I stood there with a dish towel in my hand and I said, "Oh," which is not a sentence, which is not a boundary, which is not anything at all. I told myself I'd think about it later, that it was probably not a big deal, that I hadn't touched that money in 12 years and probably wasn't going to need it, and that if it helped Ashley have her wedding, maybe that was fine. I have thought about that moment more than almost any other moment in this entire story, because it was the moment I could have asked the question that would have saved everyone, including my parents, from what eventually happened. I could have asked, how much money is actually in there? I could have asked, is that account even still in my name, or is it still yours? I could have asked, simply, don't you think you should ask me before you decide that, instead of after? I didn't ask. I dried the dishes, and I went home, and I didn't think about it again until March, 4 months later, when my mother handed me a folder of old paperwork to shred. Christmas morning. Christmas that year fell 8 weeks before Ashley's wedding, and my parents' house was, as always, decorated within an inch of its life. My mother's nativity set on the mantel, the same artificial tree she'd used since I was in high school, stockings with our names embroidered on them by a neighbor 20 years earlier. Mine a little faded now compared to Ashley's, which had been re-embroidered at some point without my noticing when. Sophia, 7 that year, tore through wrapping paper with the single-minded joy only a 7-year-old can bring to a pile of presents. And for a while, the morning felt like every other Christmas morning of my life. Coffee, cinnamon rolls, my father in his recliner reading instructions for whatever gadget someone had bought him. My mother directing the flow of gift opening like a stage manager who'd blocked the scene 100 times before. Then my mother handed Ashley an envelope, the same kind of envelope my grandmother used to hand out every Christmas Eve, and said, "This one's from all of us, honey, for the wedding." Ashley opened it and gasped, a check, folded inside a card, for an amount I didn't see, but that made her throw her arms around both our parents at once, laughing and crying in the same breath. My mother turned to me a moment later, still glowing from Ashley's reaction, and handed me a much smaller envelope. Inside was a gift card to a home goods store, $40, tucked inside a card that said, in my mother's handwriting, to our responsible girl, who never needs as much as the rest of us to be happy. I read it twice, standing by the tree with wrapping paper at my feet, and I remember the specific, quiet ache of realizing that the compliment and the theft were, in that moment, the exact same sentence. The same belief, dressed up as praise, that had let my mother feel fine about writing a wedding check out of an account she'd apparently decided, sometime in the last few months, was simply hers to write checks from. I didn't ask, that morning, where the wedding check had come from. I told myself it was probably from my parents' own savings, or an early contribution from Gerald Whitfield, or 100 other explanations that didn't involve an account with my name on the tab. I have wondered many times since whether some part of me already suspected the truth that Christmas morning and simply wasn't ready yet to go looking for it. I think that's probably exactly what happened. Some truths you have to be ready for before you're able to see them, even when they're sitting in a card in your own two hands. 3 months later, I would find the folder. The folder. The Sunday I found the statement, I'd driven over to help my mother sort through the attic. She'd decided, with the wedding 6 months out and relatives about to descend on the house, that it was finally time to clear out 3 decades of accumulated paper. I spent 2 hours going through boxes of old tax returns, expired warranties, and photographs of relatives I didn't recognize, while my mother directed traffic from her chair, deciding what stayed and what went to the shredder pile. The folder with my name on it, MELANIE, in my grandmother's handwriting on the tab, was near the bottom of a box otherwise full of old church bulletins. My mother said, without much interest, "Oh, just shred that. Old bank stuff, nothing current." I don't know what made me open it before I shredded it. Maybe it was the handwriting. Maybe some part of me had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this moment. I opened the folder and found a stack of old statements going back to when I was a teenager, and on top, the most recent one, dated 4 months earlier, after Thanksgiving, after the conversation in the kitchen, after my mother had told me the money was just sitting there. Balance, $340.12. I sat very still for a moment. Then I did the thing I do for a living. I started reconciling. I flipped back through the older statements in the folder, watching the number climb over the years of my childhood, watching my grandparents' additions land like clockwork every December, watching the balance sit at just over $41,000 the spring I graduated college. Then I watched it, over the following 12 years, drop in a series of withdrawals I didn't recognize, none of them large enough on their own to seem alarming, all of them adding up to something that made my hands go cold. $2,200 for a family vacation to the Outer Banks when I was 24, a trip I remembered, a trip my parents had told me they'd saved up for specially. $4,000 the year my father's truck needed a new transmission. $3,500 that simply said transfer. The year Ashley's community college classes weren't working out and she needed, my mother had said at the time, a fresh start that involved a semester living in an apartment near a different school she also didn't finish. And then, in the 4 months before the statement I was holding, 3 withdrawals totaling just over $28,000, a number that matched, almost to the dollar, the vineyard deposit, a dress, a florist, and a string quartet. I photographed every page of that folder with my phone before I put it back exactly where I'd found it. Then I told my mother the shredding was done, kissed her on the cheek, and drove home in complete silence, with Sophia's car seat empty in the back because she'd stayed home with Marcus, which was, in retrospect, a small mercy. I didn't have to explain to an 8-year-old why her mother wasn't speaking. I want to be honest about what I felt, because devastated doesn't capture it. What I felt was the specific, disorienting nausea of realizing that a story I'd told myself my whole life. I am the responsible one, the trusted one, the one whose future was never in question, had been, in the most literal financial sense, false. The money that was supposed to represent my future had been spent, over 12 years, in small enough pieces that I never noticed, on things that were never mine. I didn't confront anyone that day. I drove home, put the phone in a drawer, and made dinner like nothing had happened, because that is what I do. I observe, I document, I wait. It's not weakness. It took me years to understand that it's actually the opposite. A quiet decision. I didn't tell Marcus for 4 days. Not because I was hiding it from him, but because I needed to sit with it myself first, the way I sit with a discrepancy in a ledger before I bring it to my boss. I needed to understand the shape of the problem before I could describe it to someone else. On the 5th day, after Sophia was asleep, I sat down at our kitchen table with my laptop and showed Marcus the photos. He read through them slowly, the way he reads through a stack of student essays, giving each one real attention. When he finished, he looked up at me and said, "How long have you known your parents were doing this?" "I didn't know," I said. "I mean, I knew there was an account. I didn't know it was gone." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing that changed the shape of everything that came after. "Melly, this isn't really about the money. I mean, It's real money, it's a lot of money. But it's about the fact that they decided, without asking you, that your future was less important than Ashley's wedding. And they'd been deciding that for 12 years before you ever found out. I cried that night, for the first time since I'd found the folder. Not loud crying. I don't do loud, even in private, just a slow, steady leaking that lasted about 20 minutes, while Marcus sat next to me and didn't try to fix it, just put his hand on my back and let me feel it. The next morning, I called my best friend, Priya Patel, who I've worked alongside for 9 years and who is the only person at my office who knows me well enough to tell when something's wrong before I say a word. We met for coffee before our shift. I showed her the photos on my phone. Priya, who has a mind built for exactly this kind of problem, she runs internal audits for a healthcare network, went quiet in a way I recognized, the same quiet I go into when I'm looking at a number that doesn't add up. "This isn't just a family thing anymore, Mel," she said. "This is custodial account mismanagement. Do you know if that account was ever transferred into your name after you turned 18? I didn't know. I told her I'd always assumed it had been, because my parents had told me more than once over the years that it's your money, it's just easier for us to manage it. Priya's eyebrows went up at that. "That's not how it's supposed to work," she said. "If that account was a custodial account, like a UTMA or something similar, your parents were legally required to hand over full control to you once you hit the age of majority. If they didn't do that, and they kept spending it after you turned 18, that's not just a family betrayal. Depending on how it was set up, that could be a legal problem for them." I didn't want it to be a legal problem. I want to be honest about that too. What I wanted, sitting in that coffee shop, was for someone to tell me I'd misunderstood, that there was an explanation that didn't mean what it looked like it meant. But Priya isn't the kind of friend who tells you what you want to hear. She's the kind who tells you what's true and then sits with you while you figure out what to do about it. "You need to see a lawyer," she said. "Not to sue your parents, just to understand what you're actually looking at before you decide anything." That night, I told Marcus I wanted to talk to someone. Not a lawyer yet. First, I wanted to talk to Dr. Ann Ackhaffer, the therapist I'd seen briefly after Sophia was born, when the exhaustion of new motherhood had unearthed some things about my own childhood I hadn't examined in a while. I called and got an appointment for the following week. Sitting across from Dr. Ackhaffer, I told her the whole story, the doll when I was 12, the phone calls about the fund, the folder, the $340.12. She listened without interrupting, the way she always did, and when I finished, she asked me a question I still think about. "Melanie, when you imagine confronting your parents about this, what are you most afraid of?" I sat with that for a long time. "That they'll say I'm making a big deal out of nothing," I finally said. "That they'll say Ashley needed it more. That they'll say I should be grateful I never needed the money at all, so what does it matter?" "And if they say that," Dr. Ackhaffer said, "will it be true?" It wasn't true. I knew it wasn't true even as I said it out loud. The money had been mine. The intention behind it, my grandparents' intention, had been mine. And whether or not I'd needed it in the years since didn't change the fact that it had been taken, quietly, over more than a decade, without ever once asking me. I left that session with something I hadn't had going in. Clarity that this wasn't about whether I could survive without the money. I could. I had a good job, a good marriage, a healthy daughter, a paid-off car. This was about the truth of what had happened, and about what kind of relationship I wanted to have with my family going forward, one built on honesty, or one built on the silent arrangement I'd lived inside for 34 years, where I gave and never asked for an accounting. I decided in the week after that session that I would get the accounting. Quietly, completely, before I said a single word to my parents. Preparation. I met with a lawyer named Nathan Cole, a calm, unhurried man in his 50s who'd spent much of his career in estate and trust law, recommended by Priya's cousin. I brought the photographs from the folder, and over the course of an hour, he walked me through what I was actually looking at. "Based on what you're describing," he said, "this sounds like it may have been set up as a custodial savings account, likely under the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act, which was common for accounts like this in Pennsylvania around the time you were born. If that's what it was, the account should have automatically converted to your sole control once you reach the age of majority. 21. Under Pennsylvania's UTMA rules, unless the account documents specified otherwise. Any withdrawals your parents made after that point, without your authorization, could be considered a breach of fiduciary duty, essentially, misuse of funds they were legally obligated to protect on your behalf. What does that mean I can actually do? I asked. That depends on what you want, he said. You could pursue this legally, demand an accounting, potentially seek restitution through civil court. That's a real option, and if the numbers are what you're describing, you'd likely have a strong case. But a lot of people in your position aren't looking to sue their parents. They're looking for acknowledgement, boundaries, and protection going forward. My advice, before you decide anything, is to get the actual bank records, not photos of a folder, but the real, complete transaction history from the bank itself. Once you have that, you'll know exactly what you're dealing with, and you can decide what kind of resolution you actually want. That was the piece I was missing. The actual bank, the actual paper trail, not just what my parents had chosen to keep in a folder in an attic. Nathan helped me draft a formal request, as the presumed rightful owner of a UTMA account originally opened in my name, for the complete transaction history going back to when the account was opened. I sent that request not to my parents, but directly to the bank, 3 weeks before Ashley's wedding. The bank. The account had been with the same regional bank my whole life, Keystone Trust Savings, the branch on Route 22 that I'd walked into as a kid to deposit birthday checks. I called ahead and made an appointment rather than just walking in, because I wanted to talk to someone who could actually explain what they were looking at, not just print a statement and send me on my way. I met with a branch manager named Rebecca Voss, a precise, kind woman in her 40s who reminded me, in the best way, of myself. Someone who took numbers seriously because she understood what they represented in people's actual lives. I brought my ID, my birth certificate, and the letter from Nathan Cole. I explained the situation as plainly as I could. An account opened in my name as a minor, statements showing my grandparents' contributions over the years, and photographs showing a balance that had dropped from over $41,000 to $340.12 over the past 12 years, mostly in withdrawals I hadn't authorized. Rebecca pulled up the account on her screen, and I watched her expression change as she scrolled. This account was opened under the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act, she confirmed, echoing what Nathan had told me. Under the terms on file, custodial control should have automatically transferred to you as the beneficiary on your 21st birthday. I'm seeing here that a transfer request was never filed by your parents to formally close out their custodial role, which legally means they should have lost signing authority on this account 13 years ago. Any withdrawals made after that date were made using authority they no longer legally held. So how were they still able to withdraw money? I asked. Banks don't always catch these transitions automatically unless someone files the paperwork, Rebecca said. It's a gap in the system, honestly, one we're required to flag when it's brought to our attention, which is exactly what you're doing right now. I can pull the complete transaction history for you today, and I'll flag the account for a compliance review on our end, since what you're describing may constitute misuse of custodial funds. She printed out 13 years of transaction history. Every withdrawal, every date, every amount, all of it matching almost exactly what I'd pieced together from the folder, but complete, official, time-stamped, and now impossible to dispute or explain away as a misunderstanding. Rebecca also gave me something I hadn't expected. A formal letter, on bank letterhead, confirming that per the account's original UTMA designation, sole authority had legally transferred to me on my 21st birthday, and that any subsequent withdrawals by the listed custodians, my parents, had occurred without legal authorization. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home. Not because the numbers surprised me anymore, I'd already seen the shape of it in the folder, but because now I was holding something that wasn't a family disagreement anymore. It was documentation. It was, whether I wanted it to be or not, evidence. What Rebecca Voss found. 2 weeks after my meeting with Rebecca Voss at Keystone Trust, she called me at work, her voice careful in the way of someone delivering something official. The compliance review is complete, she said. "I want to walk you through it in person if you have time to come in." I sat across from her again in the same small office, the transaction history spread between us, now annotated with the bank's internal findings. "Your account converted to full custodial-free status on your 21st birthday, exactly as I told you," she said. "After that date, there were 11 separate withdrawals made using your parents' original signing credentials that should have been deactivated automatically, but weren't, due to what our records show as a processing gap dating back to a system migration the bank went through that year. We've since corrected that gap system-wide, which is, frankly, overdue, and your case is part of the reason we're doing it." "So they didn't hack anything," I said. "They just kept using access nobody ever told them to stop using." "Functionally, yes," Rebecca said, "which doesn't make it authorized. It makes it a mistake on our end that they took advantage of, whether or not they understood the legal nuance at the time. I want to be clear with you, the bank bears some responsibility here for not closing that access properly, and I've noted that in the compliance file." But 11 withdrawals over 13 years, several of them explicitly discussed in family communications as being drawn from Melanie's account, according to what you've described, suggests the people making these withdrawals understood exactly whose money it was, even if they didn't understand, or didn't care, that they no longer had the legal right to spend it. She gave me a second letter that day, a formal compliance summary I could use however I chose, quietly, in a family conversation, or through legal channels if it came to that. I thanked her, and on my way out, she said one more thing that stayed with me for a long time. "I see a version of this every few years," she said. "Family accounts, good intentions at the start, and then somewhere along the way, one person's need starts to feel more urgent than another person's right. It's never really about the money, in the end. It's about who a family decides matters enough to ask first." I told Priya about that conversation the next morning at work, over coffee in the break room. Priya had been divorced once herself, in her late 20s, from a marriage where her ex-husband had quietly run up debt on a shared credit card for 2 years before she found out. A story she'd told me years earlier, in pieces, the way people tell you the parts of their past that still ache. "That's why I pushed you toward the lawyer instead of just towards a hard conversation," she admitted that morning. "I know what it feels like to find out, after years of trusting someone, that they'd already decided the answer to a question you never got to ask. Documentation is the only thing that protects you from someone rewriting the story afterward. I learned that the expensive way. I didn't want you to have to." It was the first time Priya had told me the full context of why she cared so much about getting this right, and it deepened something between us that had, until then, mostly lived in the shorthand of work friendship, shared coffee, shared complaints about spreadsheets, the easy company of two people who understood each other's professional instincts. After that conversation, I understood that Priya wasn't just being a good friend. She was handing me the exact tool that had been missing from her own story, years too late to help her, but exactly in time to help me. The group chat. 2 weeks before the wedding, our family group chat, the one my mother had created years earlier, called Ray's Family Fun, with a cake emoji next to the name, lit up with a crisis. Ashley's dress alteration had come in higher than expected, and the florist wanted the final balance a week earlier than planned because of a supply issue. My mother wrote, "Don't panic, everyone, your father and I will handle it, we always do." I sat there with my phone in my hand, in the parking lot outside Sophia's school, watching my parents casually promise to handle yet another wedding expense. 3 weeks after I'd sat across from a bank manager who'd told me, in plain language, that the money they'd been handling things with for over a decade had never legally been theirs to spend. I didn't respond in the group chat. I've learned over the course of this whole ordeal that group chats are not where important truths should ever be delivered. They turn everything into a performance, with an audience, and audiences make people defensive in ways that make honest conversation impossible. I put my phone away and picked Sophia up from school and made dinner, and did not, for one more week, say a single word to anyone in my family about what I knew. That week was the hardest part of this entire story for me, harder in some ways than anything that came after. I sat in the same room as my parents at a pre-wedding dinner, watched my mother fuss over seating charts, watched my father proudly tell Gerald Whitfield that the family was all in on making this day perfect for Ashley, and I said nothing, because I had decided, with Nathan Cole's guidance, that the wedding itself was not the place for this conversation. Ashley had not taken anything from me. Ashley, as far as I could tell, didn't even know where the money for her wedding was actually coming from. Whatever conversation needed to happen with my parents, and it needed to happen in a way that didn't detonate my sister's wedding day. That decision, to wait until after the wedding, is the one people ask me about most when they hear this story. Why did I let them keep spending it? Why didn't I stop it before the last check cleared? The honest answer is that by the time I had the bank documentation in hand, the money was already gone. Stopping the wedding wouldn't have brought it back. It would have only added a public humiliation on top of a private theft and hurt my sister, who hadn't done anything wrong. I wanted accountability, not collateral damage. So I waited. I let Ashley have her wedding. The vineyard. The wedding was, by every outward measure, beautiful. It was held at a vineyard in the rolling hills outside town, string lights threaded through the trellises, a quartet playing as guests arrived, my sister in a dress that had cost more than my first car, walking down an aisle lined with white roses toward a man who, whatever his family's obliviousness about money, clearly loved her. I sat in the second row, next to Marcus, with Sophia between us in a little blue dress, and I watched my parents beam from the front row like the proudest people in the world. And I felt something complicated that I still don't have a clean word for. Not quite anger, not quite grief. Something more like the specific ache of loving people while also, for the first time in your life, seeing them clearly. My father gave a toast at the reception. He said, his voice thick with emotion, we would do anything for our girls, anything at all. The room applauded. Ashley cried. Tom's father raised his glass. I raised mine too, because that's what you do, and I meant part of it. I did love my sister. I was glad she was happy. But I sat there holding a glass of champagne, knowing exactly what anything at all had actually cost, and knowing that I was the only person in that room who understood the full arithmetic of that sentence. I danced with Marcus. I made small talk with cousins I hadn't seen in years. I held Sophia on my hip during the bouquet toss and let her squeal when Ashley's cousin caught it. I did everything a good sister is supposed to do at a wedding, and I did it well, because I have spent my entire life being good at doing what I'm supposed to do. Nobody in that room, watching me, would have known that 3 weeks earlier I'd been sitting in a bank manager's office, holding a letter that confirmed, in writing, that my parents had been quietly draining my future for over a decade. That night, driving home with Sophia asleep in her car seat, Marcus reached over and took my hand. You did good today, he said. For Ashley, for yourself too, actually. You didn't let this ruin something that wasn't hers to ruin. I know, I said, but it's over now. The wedding's done, there's nothing left to protect by staying quiet. He glanced at me, so what happens now? Now, I said, I asked them to explain it to my face. The family barbecue. I chose a Sunday 3 weeks after the wedding. Enough time for the dust to settle, for thank you cards to be sent, for life to return to something resembling normal. My parents were hosting their annual end-of-summer barbecue, the one they'd hosted every August for as long as I could remember, with my father's sister Diane and her husband Pete, a few neighbors, Ashley and Tom fresh off their honeymoon in Aruba, and, this year, an addition to the guest list I made myself. I asked if I could bring Nathan Cole's letter, and I asked Marcus to come with Sophia, but to take her inside to watch a movie when the conversation started, so she wouldn't be in the room for it. I didn't announce that I was bringing documents. I didn't want an ambush disguised as a barbecue, and I didn't want a public spectacle either. This wasn't about humiliating my parents in front of Diane and Pete and the neighbors. I waited until the burgers were done, until most of the guests had drifted toward the yard with plates in hand, and I asked my parents, quietly, if we could talk inside for a few minutes. My mother's face did something complicated when I said it. A flicker of recognition, gone almost as fast as it appeared, like some part of her had been waiting for this conversation for longer than she would ever admit. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd read the statement 5 months earlier, the same table where my father had once set aside my account statement to wait on top of the refrigerator when I was 16. I laid out three things: the photographs from the folder, the complete transaction history from Rebecca Voss, and Nathan Cole's letter confirming that legal control of the account had transferred to me at 21. "I want to understand something," I said, keeping my voice level the way I'd practiced with Dr. Ackefer. "This was my account. Legally, it stopped being yours to manage when I turned 21, but you kept withdrawing from it for 13 more years, including $28,000 in the 4 months before Ashley's wedding. I need you to explain that to me." My father's face went pale. My mother's went the opposite direction, flushed, defensive, already reaching for the explanation she must have been rehearsing without knowing she'd need it. "Melanie, that money was always meant for the family," she said. "You never needed it. You had your scholarship, you had Marcus, you were doing fine. Ashley needed help. We didn't think it was a big deal." "It wasn't your decision to make," I said. "That's the whole point. You didn't ask me. You didn't tell me. You let me believe for 13 years that account still existed, still had money in it, still represented what Grandpa Walt and Grandma Ruth built for me. And this spring, you handed me a folder and told me to shred it without telling me what was actually in it." My father spoke then, quietly, in a voice I didn't recognize, not defensive, just tired. "We always meant to tell you eventually. Every time there was a good moment to tell you, there was also a reason not to. And then it got harder every year to say it, because it got worse every year." "I know it got worse every year," I said, and I turned the transaction history around so they could see it. "I have the dates. I have the amounts. I know about the Outer Banks trip. I know about the truck transmission. I know about Ashley's semester in that apartment. And I know about the wedding because it's $28,000 and it happened 4 months ago." There was a long silence. My mother started to cry, the way she always cried when things went a direction she couldn't control, not manipulative tears, I don't think, just genuine distress at being seen clearly for the first time in a long time. My father put his head in his hands. And then I said the line that I've repeated so many times since, in my own head, in conversations with Marcus, in the quiet moments when I need to remind myself why any of this was worth doing. "I'm not here because I need the money back to survive. I'm here because you decided, over and over, for 13 years, that my future was something you could spend without asking, and I need you to understand that it was never yours to spend." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Outside, through the kitchen window, I could hear Diane laughing at something Pete said, and the ordinary sound of the barbecue continuing without us, a whole yard full of people who had no idea what had just happened 20 feet away. Consequences. What happened after that conversation didn't look like a movie. There was no dramatic disowning, no screaming match, no slammed doors. It was quieter and, in its own way, harder. My father, over the following weeks, took responsibility in a way that surprised me. He called me 2 days after the barbecue and said, without prompting, "I've been up most nights since Sunday. I know saying sorry doesn't put the money back, but I am sorry, and I want to figure out some kind of plan to make this right, even if it takes years." He meant it, as far as I could tell. Over the following year, my parents began making monthly payments toward restitution, not court-ordered, just agreed upon between us, a modest amount each month that acknowledged what had happened without pretending it could be undone quickly. It will take them close to a decade to repay it in full at that rate. I told them I didn't need it repaid on any particular timeline. I needed it acknowledged, and I needed the payments to be real, not symbolic. My mother had a harder time. For the first few months, she oscillated between guilt and a kind of wounded defensiveness, telling Diane at one point that I was punishing them for trying to help your sister. A comment that got back to me the way things always got back to me in that family, through the same channels of gossip that had shaped my whole childhood. I didn't respond to that directly. I let it sit. Eventually, in October, my mother called me and said, quietly, "I keep thinking about what you said, about how it was never ours to spend. I think I always knew that, and I just didn't want to know it, because knowing it would have meant admitting I was choosing your sister over you, over and over, and I didn't want to be the kind of mother who did that." It wasn't a full apology, but it was the most honest thing my mother had ever said to me, and I've held on to it. Ashley's reaction was the one I feared most, and the one that turned out in the end to be the most complicated. I told her myself, a week after the barbecue conversation, over coffee, without documents, without accusation. I just told her what had happened plainly and let her ask questions. She cried. She said she'd had no idea, that she'd always assumed the wedding money was coming from savings and from Tom's father, that if she'd known it was my account, she never would have let it happen. I believe her. I still believe her. But there was a hard month after that where she couldn't quite look at me, caught between guilt over what she'd unknowingly benefited from and a defensive instinct to protect our parents from the consequences of what they'd done. We had one difficult conversation in November where she said, "I don't know how to feel like I deserve my own wedding now." And I told her the truth, that she deserved her wedding, that none of this was her fault, and that the only people responsible for what happened were the two people who'd made the decision without telling either of us the truth. Slowly, over the following months, Ashley and I found our way back to something real, not the old dynamic, where I managed things and she needed things, but something more equal, built on the fact that for the first time in our adult lives, we'd had a genuinely honest conversation about how our family actually worked. Tom, for his part, offered, quietly, without making it a whole production, to contribute toward the restitution my parents owed me, since some of the wedding costs had technically benefited him too. I told him that wasn't necessary, that this wasn't his debt to carry, but I appreciated that he offered, and it told me something good about the family Ashley had married into. What Diane said at Easter. Aunt Diane found out about all of it the way most of the extended family eventually did, not from me, but from my mother, who called her sister-in-law one evening, apparently needing someone to talk to who wasn't in the direct line of consequences. Diane called me herself 2 days later, and I braced for the conversation to go the way family conversations about money in my family usually went, full of soft deflection and gentle pressure to let it go for the sake of peace. Instead, Diane said something I didn't expect. "I told your mother 20 years ago she needed to be straight with you girls about the money," she said. I sat at that table and said it to her face, and she smiled at me and changed the subject, same as she always did. I should have pushed harder. I've thought about that phone call every day since Carol told me what happened, and I'm sorry I didn't say more back then, when it might have actually stopped something. At Easter that year, Diane pulled me aside in the kitchen, away from the noise of the table, and told me quietly that she thought what I'd done, waiting, documenting, confronting them calmly instead of blowing up the wedding, was the kind of strength nobody in this family ever taught you, but you found it anyway. Pete, from his corner chair with a paperback open on his knee, looked up just long enough to say, "Good for you, kid," which from Pete was practically a speech. Diane's own guilt about that decades-old warning became, in its own quiet way, one of the more healing threads of the whole aftermath. She started calling me more often after that Easter, not about family business, just to check in, and I understood it as her own way of trying to be, this late in both our lives, the kind of family member she wished she'd been 30 years earlier. Long-term resolution. It's been 3 years now since that conversation at the kitchen table. My parents have kept up their monthly payments without missing one, which I think has mattered to all of us more than the actual dollar amount. It's become a monthly ritual of accountability, a small, steady act of taking responsibility that no apology alone could have provided. We are not where we were before any of this happened. We are, I think, somewhere better, though it took a long time and a lot of uncomfortable Sundays to get here. My relationship with my father has, unexpectedly, deepened. He calls me now just to talk, something he rarely did before, and last year on my birthday, he gave me a card that said, simply, "I know I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know I see you now, in a way I don't think I ever really did before. Melanie, you were never the daughter who needed less. You were just the daughter who asked for less, and I mistook that for the same thing." I keep that card in a drawer in my office, and I read it sometimes when I need to remember that people can change, slowly, imperfectly, if you give them the chance and hold the boundary at the same time. My mother and I are still working on it. We talk every week. She stopped making comments about Ashley needing things I don't need mostly, though old habits surface sometimes, and I've learned to name them gently when they do, instead of swallowing them the way I used to. Boundaries, I've learned, aren't something you establish once. They're something you maintain, quietly, over and over, for as long as the relationship exists. Ashley and I are closer now than we've ever been. She calls me sometimes just to check in, and last spring, She opened her own education fund for the daughter she and Tom had, and asked me, half joking, half serious, to be the one who kept an eye on the paperwork every year, so nothing like this ever happens to her. I said yes. It felt like the right kind of closure, not revenge, just the chance to make sure the next generation of our family gets the thing that got taken from mine. A fund that actually stays exactly where it's supposed to be. I used part of the restitution money my parents have paid so far, along with money Marcus and I had already been saving, to open Sophia's own education account this year, at Keystone Trust, with Rebecca Voss helping me set it up correctly this time, fully documented, automatically converting to Sophia's sole control the moment she turns 21, with paperwork filed the same year it's opened, so there is never, ever a question about who that money belongs to. What remained? People ask me sometimes if I regret waiting as long as I did, waiting through the wedding, waiting through the honeymoon, waiting almost half a year from the day I found that folder to the day I finally sat my parents down at the kitchen table. I don't regret it. I think the waiting was, in its own way, the most important part of the whole story. It gave me time to move from reaction to understanding, from hurt to clarity, from a daughter who might have said something in anger she couldn't take back, to a woman who could sit across from her parents, holding real documentation and say, calmly, exactly what needed to be said. I think about that folder often, the one my mother handed me and told me to shred. I think about how close I came to actually shredding it, how easily this whole story could have ended in an attic on a Sunday afternoon, with 13 years of quiet theft disappearing into a paper shredder along with the church bulletins. I didn't shred it. I read it. And reading it, instead of destroying it, changed everything that came after. If there's a single thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. The people who take from you quietly are counting on you never keeping track. They're counting on your trust, your good nature, your reluctance to make a scene, to be the very thing that lets them keep going. But paper trails don't lie, and banks keep records, and sometimes the quietest, most patient response. Not a scream, not a scene, just a folder of documentation laid calmly on a kitchen table. Is the loudest thing you can ever say to the people who assumed you'd never say anything at all. It was never yours to spend. I said it once at that kitchen table, and I've said it to myself many times since on the harder days, when guilt tries to creep back in and tell me I made too big a deal out of something I didn't even need. I didn't need the money. That was never the point. The point was the truth, and the truth, once I had the paper trail to prove it, was something nobody in my family could take from me again. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the responsible one, the one nobody worried about, the one whose trust got quietly spent while everyone assumed you'd never notice, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me your story. And if you want to hear more true stories like this one, stories about the quiet kind of family reckoning that doesn't need to be loud to be real, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.